Winter, 1943. Somewhere in rural Ontario, Canada. The barbed wire was real. The guard towers were real. The prisoners were very real. But something about this camp didn't make sense. Hundreds of captured German soldiers had been transported across the Atlantic after being taken in North Africa and Europe. They expected brutality, interrogations, isolation. Instead, they were handed warm blankets. One POW later wrote in his diary, "We were treated not as enemies, but as men." The guards were firm, disciplined, but calm. There were no beatings, no shouting, just rules. Work details were assigned to nearby farms, logging operations, road clearing, harvest work. And here was the first shock. They were paid. Not full civilian wages, but camp scrip they could spend on small luxuries inside the camp: tobacco, chocolate, books. The Canadian authorities had made a deliberate decision. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were to be treated humanely. Canada followed it strictly, almost obsessively. Some prisoners began asking a dangerous question. Is this a trap? They had been told Canada was weak, soft, disorganized, but this was discipline without cruelty. Then came the moment that spread through the barracks like wildfire. A Canadian officer reportedly told a group of prisoners, "You can leave if you want." At first, they thought it was mockery, but it wasn't. He clarified. There were miles of wilderness, snow, forest, frozen lakes, no transport, no friendly territory for thousands of kilometers. "You're not locked in by hatred," he said calmly. "You're locked in by geography." And that was the truth. Some men tested it. A few attempted escape. Most returned voluntarily, not because they were forced back, but because survival outside was nearly impossible, and inside the camp they were fed, warm, and treated fairly. That psychological shift changed everything. The guards didn't need brutality. They had something stronger: order and dignity. But this strange experiment had consequences no one expected.
Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.
The first time it happened, the prisoners thought it was a trick. A work detail had been assigned to a nearby farming community. It was late spring, 1943. The snow had melted, and the fields were soft with thawing soil. The POWs were escorted under light guard. No rifles pointed at their backs, no shouting, just quiet supervision. They were told they would help repair fencing and clear land for planting. As they approached the farmhouse, something unexpected happened. An elderly Canadian farmer stepped forward and spoke in perfect German. Not broken phrases, not rehearsed sentences. Fluent, native level. The prisoners froze. Some of them had been told that everyone outside their homeland was hostile, that no one understood them, that they were alone. Yet here stood a man in overalls in rural Canada, calmly giving instructions in their own language. Then his wife came outside. She spoke German too. So did their daughter. Within hours, more conversations followed. Other nearby farms had families with similar backgrounds, immigrants who had arrived decades before the war. Many of them had left Europe long before conflict consumed it. They weren't political, they weren't interested in ideology, they were farmers, and they needed help. The psychological effect was immediate. The prisoners had expected resentment. Instead, they found something far more disarming: normalcy. At midday, the farmer's wife brought out sandwiches and hot tea. The POWs were not allowed inside the home, but they were offered food at the work site. One young prisoner reportedly asked quietly, "Why are you treating us like this?" The farmer's answer was simple: "Because when this is over, you'll still be men." That sentence spread through the camp faster than any rumor, but not everyone liked what was happening. Inside the camp, tensions began to rise. Some prisoners believed cooperation was betrayal. Others began questioning everything they had been taught. And Canadian authorities noticed something unexpected. Escape attempts dropped sharply after outside work programs expanded. because something had shifted. The barbed wire wasn't the strongest barrier anymore. Perspective was. But this experiment in dignity would soon face its first serious test.
Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.
By late 1943, something had changed inside the camp. It wasn't the food, it wasn't the guards, it wasn't the work assignments, it was the prisoners. The outside farm work program had created an unexpected divide. Some POWs began returning from work details quieter, thoughtful. They had seen Canadian families up close. They had spoken their native language freely. They had witnessed ordinary life continuing without propaganda, without fear, and that created tension, because not everyone inside the camp wanted questions. Among the prisoners were hardened loyalists, men who believed absolute discipline must be maintained even in captivity. They had formed informal leadership groups within the barracks. They controlled conversations. They watched who spoke too freely. They labeled cooperation as weakness. When one young prisoner mentioned that a Canadian farmer had shown him a family photo and talked about his sons serving overseas, an older POW reportedly snapped, "Do not forget who you are." The camp itself became divided into invisible lines. Barracks were no longer just sleeping quarters. They became ideological territories. Canadian authorities began noticing patterns. Certain prisoners isolated others. Whispers at night. Peer pressure. Intimidation. Subtle but present. The irony was impossible to ignore. The camp had been designed to avoid brutality, but inside the wire, pressure was building from within. One evening, a quiet confrontation occurred in a barracks after lights out. No weapons, no chaos, just raised voices in the dark. A prisoner who had worked on farms openly questioned the narrative he had grown up believing. He asked a dangerous question. If they are monsters, why do they treat us like men? Silence followed. That question spread, and it could not be unasked. Canadian officers, aware of the growing divide, made a calculated decision. They expanded education programs inside the camp. Libraries grew. Language classes were offered. Lectures were organized. They understood something critical. Control through fear collapses when doubt enters the room. But then came an incident that nearly shattered the entire experiment. A group of hardliners attempted to reassert dominance, and for the first time, Canadian authorities had to decide, would dignity still be enough, or would they need to show force?
Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.
Winter returned early in 1944. Snow pressed against the barracks walls. Wind howled across the open yard. Inside the camp, the divide had hardened. The hardliners were no longer whispering. They were organizing. It started with subtle pressure. Certain prisoners excluded from card games, meals, conversations. Then came public accusations. You are forgetting your duty. You are becoming soft. You speak too comfortably with the guards. The men who worked regularly on Canadian farms were now viewed with suspicion. One evening, a heated exchange erupted in Barracks 7. It wasn't violent, but it was loud enough that guards outside noticed raised voices through the thin wooden walls. A young POW stood his ground. He had spent weeks repairing fences for a farming family. He had seen their sons' letters from overseas. He had eaten the same bread they did, and he said something that fractured the room. They are not what we were told. The silence that followed was heavy. One of the hardliners stepped forward. Then perhaps you no longer belong here. The tension felt different that night. Not physical, ideological. Canadian officers had long understood that camps were fragile ecosystems. Remove fear, and something else fills the space. The following morning, several moderate prisoners reported intimidation to camp authorities. It was a quiet move, but it forced a decision. Until that moment, Canadian policy had been simple. Minimal interference in internal prisoner affairs. Maintain order. Avoid humiliation. Preserve dignity. But now, they had to intervene. Not with punishment, but with structure. Within weeks, the camp introduced supervised discussion forums, structured education programs, and controlled work assignments that deliberately mixed groups together. Loyalists, doubters, quiet observers. The goal wasn't re-education, it was stabilization, and for a moment it seemed to work. Then something happened that nearly destroyed the balance entirely. A small group disappeared during a work detail. Not lost, not confused, deliberate. And this time, they did not return voluntarily. The Canadian command faced a dangerous question. If escape became organized instead of desperate, would the world still see these camps as humane? The experiment was about to be tested by the harshest judge of all, reality.
Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.
They had chosen their moment carefully. A work detail near the edge of a logging route. Light supervision. Snow deep enough to cover tracks, or so they believed. When the two prisoners slipped toward the tree line, no one shouted. No alarm sounded immediately. They walked, not ran, into the forest. For the first hour, confidence carried them. The camp faded behind them. The guard tower disappeared. The silence of the Canadian wilderness swallowed every sound. No fences, no barbed wire, freedom, or so it felt. But winter in rural Ontario was not symbolic. It was physical. Heavy snow slowed their pace. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset. Their boots were not built for long-distance winter travel. They had believed farms would be close. They weren't. They had believed towns would be visible. They weren't. The Canadian landscape was vast in a way maps never conveyed. Inside the camp, the absence was discovered at evening roll call. The guards did not panic. They did not storm the forest. Instead, a calculated response began. Search teams were organized quietly. Local authorities were notified. Nearby farmers were informed, calmly. Because the command understood something critical. Panic creates escalation. Calm creates control. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, the two escapees began to understand the true barrier of the camp. It had never been the guards. It had been distance. As night fell, temperatures plunged below freezing. The forest shifted from quiet to oppressive. Every branch crack sounded amplified. Every shadow felt alive. They had escaped confinement, but now they faced exposure. By the second day, hunger sharpened the edges of doubt. They had limited rations. Snowmelt provided water, but no warmth. And then came the moment neither had anticipated. In the distance, smoke, a farmhouse chimney, civilization, hope. They approached cautiously, but before they reached the structure, something unexpected happened. A truck appeared on the rural road. Not military, civilian. And the man driving it slowed down. He looked at them carefully. He knew exactly who they were. The experiment of dignity was about to face its most unpredictable variable, ordinary Canadians.
Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.
The truck rolled to a stop. The engine idled. Snow drifted quietly across the empty rural road. The farmer studied the two men standing near the ditch. Their uniforms were unmistakable. Their exhaustion was even clearer. He didn't look angry. He didn't look afraid. He simply assessed the situation. "You're a long way from camp," he said calmly. Neither prisoner reached for anything. They had nothing to reach for. The younger of the two spoke first. His voice cracked from cold. "We are not dangerous." The farmer nodded slightly, as if he already knew. Behind him, the faint column of smoke from his farmhouse chimney rose into the pale winter sky. He could turn them in immediately. The authorities had been notified hours earlier that two men were missing. Every nearby landowner had been asked to report unusual movement. It would be easy. It would be expected. Instead, he did something that neither prisoner predicted. He opened the passenger door. "Get in. You'll freeze out here." For several seconds, no one moved. This was not part of their escape plan. Inside the truck, warmth felt foreign. The smell of wood smoke and oil mixed with damp wool from their coats. They expected questions about politics, about loyalty, about the war. None came. Instead, the farmer asked a single practical question. "Did you think it through?" The older prisoner stared at the dashboard. "We thought we could make it south." The farmer let out a slow breath. South is hundreds of miles, and Winter doesn't care about borders. When they reached the farmhouse, he didn't invite them inside. He followed the rules. He handed them bread. He handed them hot tea. Then he did something even more unexpected. He walked back to the truck and turned it around. "We're going back." The drive to the camp was quiet. No handcuffs, no threats. When they reached the gate, the farmer stepped out first and approached the guard calmly. "Found them near my property. Figured they'd be safer back here." The guards nodded. No spectacle. No humiliation. The prisoners stepped back through the gate voluntarily, and that moment spread through the camp faster than any escape story ever had. They hadn't been dragged back. They had been returned by a civilian. Because outside the fence, survival depended not on ideology, but on cooperation. And inside the camp, something shifted again, not toward fear, but toward understanding. Still, command now faced a quiet but critical question. If civilians began influencing outcomes, could the experiment remain controlled? The answer would soon be tested in a way no one anticipated.
Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.
By early 1944, word about the camp had begun to travel, not through newspapers, not publicly, but through military channels. Reports described low violence rates, minimal disciplinary action, high participation in work programs, voluntary returns after escape attempts. On paper, it looked like a success, but not everyone saw it that way. In Ottawa, some officials quietly questioned the policy. Was Canada being naive? Other Allied nations operated far stricter camps. Security was tighter. Internal control was harsher. Discipline was more visible. Canada's approach relied on something harder to measure: trust, and that made some people uncomfortable. A visiting military observer toured the camp in late winter. He walked past barracks where prisoners attended language classes. He observed work groups returning from farms without chains or armed escorts. He asked a blunt question to the camp commandant. What happens if they organize? The commandant didn't hesitate. They already tried. He explained the internal tensions, the escape, the civilian return. The data showed something surprising. After the failed escape and voluntary return, camp discipline improved. Not because of punishment, but because credibility increased. The prisoners now understood the landscape, the civilians, the odds. But outside, critics weren't convinced. Some feared that leniency projected weakness, and in wartime, weakness could be exploited. Then came an intelligence report that changed the tone entirely. A small group of hardliners inside the camp had been attempting to influence other POW camps through coded letters. Nothing violent, nothing immediate, but ideological coordination. Suddenly, the question shifted. It wasn't about escapes anymore. It was about narrative control. Could an open system survive organized belief? The camp command faced its most delicate decision yet: crack down and risk destroying the psychological balance that kept order, or maintain the model and risk criticism from their own allies. The barbed wire had never been the real experiment. The experiment was whether dignity could compete with doctrine, and the next move would determine if this camp remained a quiet success or became a national controversy.
Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.
When the war ended in 1945, the gates did not burst open in chaos. They opened quietly. The men who had once stood behind the wire walked out in organized lines, not as fugitives, not as defeated ideologues, but as prisoners being processed for return. Some would go back to destroyed cities, some to divided territories, some to countries that no longer resembled the ones they had left. But many carried something unexpected with them: memory. Years later, Historians reviewing Canada's wartime POW records found something remarkable. Violence rates in Canadian camps had remained unusually low. Escape attempts were fewer than expected. Internal order had stabilized without mass punishment. But the most surprising detail came after the war. Former prisoners wrote letters, not protests, not accusations. Letters of acknowledgement. Some wrote to the farmers who had supervised work details. Some wrote to camp administrators. A few even returned to Canada decades later, not as captives, but as visitors. They remembered the cold. They remembered the isolation. But, most of all, they remembered being treated as human beings in a moment when the world had chosen brutality. The open camp policy had been criticized during the war. Some called it soft. Some called it naive. But history recorded something different. It recorded that discipline without humiliation produced stability. That dignity could prevent radicalization. That geography, not cruelty, had secured the fence. In the end, the barbed wire had not been the strongest barrier. Perspective had been. And when those gates finally opened, something else remained behind. Proof that even during total war, restraint was possible. Not perfect, not idealistic, but intentional. The camp did not become famous. It did not dominate headlines. But in military archives and private memoirs, it became a quiet example of a different kind of strength. A strength that didn't shout. A strength that didn't break men to control them. A strength that asked a simple question. What happens when you treat an enemy as a future civilian? The answer, it turned out, was written long after the fence came down.